Today we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have prepared a chart. And there are, I'm going to hand you, I think you, Jim and Glenda, you won't get to, I'll hold it up for you, but you can each have one. I don't know how many folks would be here. And I don't want, it's a lot of stuff on the page. And it kind of goes closer and closer, and I'll show you Jim and Glenda. And I'll fold it so you only get part of it, what I want you to see, so you won't get the whole confusion mess. So this is just sort of, I just want you to have a visual. As I was preparing, I was like, I kind of have loose understanding of where these things are. So we're going to start with this corner, the very top left corner. And this has a larger picture of Israel. Can you see that, Jim and Glenda?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
And I'm familiar with that map.
Okay. You're familiar with this one. Okay. So this is showing where Israel as a whole is. And obviously you have the Mediterranean Sea, you have Tel Aviv, you have Jerusalem down here. This whole area, and often people say to me, what is the West Bank? People think it's just sort of like the bank of something. It's really not. It's the bank. It has the West Bank of the Dead Sea, which is here. But it also is this large annex section, and it refers to everything from this northern part way up here near the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the south, to about halfway down the Dead Sea. Now, it's important to understand that only in the sense of this western side here, there where my finger is that's where Qumran is, which is on the west side of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the one that's like dead, and it has salt in it, and you can float around in it. Then we'll turn to, so that's just the larger picture to kind of give you. Also just noted, just modern day things. This is the Gaza Strip that leads out of Egypt. When you hear in news, sometimes people say the Gaza Strip, they're like, I don't know where that is. So this is down here by Egypt, and the Western Bank is here. So when they talk about it, Gaza Strip is a smaller portion. The Western Bank is really, or the West Bank is really just a large annex section. And there are reasons for that political control that actually stem back to the last century as well, and we'll touch a little bit on that. The next one, you can turn to the next one for you all on the page, directly to the right of the one that I just showed you, is a little bit closer. And this is the Dead Sea down here. And then it's showing you a bit of a closer outline of the West Bank. And right through here, and again, just outside of Jerusalem, you have this area where on this side of the sea is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And that's considered Judean desert.
On the left side.
I gotta look at it from my, it's kind of, the Dead Sea is kind of, this was color originally, but you can see on the east side you have Jordan, and on the west side you have Israel. But all of Israel, if you go back to this originally at the beginning of the last century was all owned by Palestine. And the UN interceded, and there was a war in the middle of the last century that kind of caused a lot of this stuff to surface. But it went from Palestine control of that region shrunk, and it was Palestine. And really, what it was is we'll talk a little bit about this, is Arab-Israeli conflict that happened around the 50s that basically took Palestine occupation of this larger area and shrunk it and shrunk it and shrunk it. And this is part of the controversy we have in the Israel-Palestine conflict today. Whose land in it is it? So it is who occupies the land, how long they've occupied the land. Israel goes back to it was it was given to them by God. There's a lot. I mean, obviously, you can't argue that Israel was there for a long time. The truth is, and I've said this before, they're all probably intermingled blood-wise. So this is very mindset-oriented, nation-oriented. And when Israel became a state in the mid 40s, 50s, or I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but that's when that sort of tension of saying, okay, now Israel's a state, and then things have shifted. And so there was originally, the UN tried to have an agreement that said Palestinians and or Arabs and Israel and Jews and Israelites could live together, and they were going to sort of divide it up. But then Israel declared their independence. The Arabs, and the Arabs, when I say Arabs, that's a grouping that had Egypt, all the way from Egypt to Jordan to a number of Saudi Arabia to a number of other people groups, and we'll list those. But what's important in the map is that you see that Jerusalem is on the eastern, or I guess what is this? Western. Looking backwards, the western side of this West Bank, and it goes all the way to the Jordan, down to the Dead Sea. So Jerusalem, in that regard, you see how it sort of is like the half. It basically became. What year was this? It doesn't say. This might have been during the annexing, but Jerusalem here you can see is half annexed. So Jerusalem was like Kansas City. Half in Missouri, half in Kansas. And so Jerusalem was half in the West Bank, which was controlled by Palestine. And so, but there's been a lot, and you can look at these moving maps online if you really want to dig into the conflict and see how it happened. Now, if we move down, we'll go closer and go down to the bottom left. Ooh, excuse me.
What's amazing to me, I guess I'd never seen it before with the scale. But, it wasn't much more than 20 miles wide and 80 miles long?
Which one?
All the West Bank, the whole West Bank.
I don't know the exact, yeah, probably, I mean, I don't know the exact, but it's not, it may, some people think it's bigger, some people think it's smaller. What's that?
Not too big. Yeah.
Oh, no, I mean, and here's, but it's at the heart of, this is the challenge of Israel's history. This is land given to them. Jerusalem is the holy city. I mean, like this is, and so, again, historical, and it goes back again and again. There's so much about the Israel-Palestine conflict that's problematic. And I think that there is biblical and historical and religious claims for Israel to the land. But at the same time, as I've said before, Israel is also evoking violence, and so is Palestine, but there's violence on both sides. But Israel, I know as a fact, because we study the Old Testament in a book, is not called to those actions. Doesn't mean Israel is living in their sense of faithfulness to Yahweh, but what we see in Israel does not necessarily, just because they are holding on to the land and defending it, doesn't mean it doesn't belong to them by some sort of, you can't say, in terms of the global context, you would say, well, what gives right from one land over the other? I mean, we're seeing this across the board in very political ways right now. But in Israel, Palestine, it goes much deeper because there's a religious significance. God gave them this land. But Israel, we also have an Old Testament that records Israel's unfaithfulness to Yahweh and Israel's punishment in that unfaithfulness. So I think that's the challenge in our modern day context around the politics of some of this, is that it's not necessarily wrong to say that it's Israel's land, but you can say that Israel is holding on to something that was originally given to them, but the manner in which they're doing it does not honor God. Anyway, so back to this. If you go to this, the one on the far left, you'll see the Dead Sea in a smaller scale. And what you have are these little spots, and on the original thing, they were red. But what these are not the caves, but these are locations of other scrolls and deposits of parchments and fragments in hidden locations. So when they say the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the Dead Sea. It goes all the way down, all this Judean desert. There are scrolls that were found throughout all of these. The vast majority were found in the caves. Now, if you turn that over to the middle, sorry, I don't know if you saw that, I'm sure. If you turn out to the middle one, it gets even closer. And you have the Dead Sea here, and this is just of the northwest bank. And this is where the caves of Qumran are. And what you see is the numbering of the caves from, and I'll note a few. Where's number one? Number one is you see number one sort of towards the top. So that's where the first cave was found, and that's when we're going to talk about the discoveries. Also notable is cave 3, that's just north of that, and that's where the copper scroll was found, which is also of interest. What's that?
Denny missed out.
I know, he's going to have to watch. Denny missed. Yeah, you're going to have to. In cave 3, they found the copper scroll. And it's really, what's interesting is although it's counted as a Dead Sea Scroll, it's it's a little bit of an interloper into what we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll talk about it in a second. But it doesn't it provides an interesting perspective or an interesting slant on what's going on. But that they're dating things, the location in the scroll, a number of things around it. The fact that there is this scroll written in a medium that doesn't, so it probably came later. And we'll get into that in a second. So that
Looks like there's two cave trees, so, I mean, is it that one or that one where that old copper?
Oh, that's
is?
interesting. I didn't notice that. Well, it's one of those cave threes. I don't know why they have that there like that. Is one supposed to be 8?
Oh, maybe.
Maybe there's a typo. Well, I don't know which cave 3 is the actual cave 3 because I didn't look that close.
7 through 9, so I guess 7 through 9 has got 8 in it.
Yeah, 7.5, 8.
Yeah.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, 7th. Oh, yeah, probably the location. I don't know. Maybe there's that's weird that they would have 2 cave 3s. You're right. I didn't notice that one looking at it. I didn't make this, so. And then in the corner, I threw this little map. That's the city of Qumran. That is during the period of so around 4 BC to around 68 AD.
So was it a walled city then?
It was, and I'm not sure exactly how this overlaps or where it was, but it's showing you just that there was, as they uncovered the caves, or if they uncovered Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they uncovered the walls of a establishment or a settlement or a city. And I don't think this is as big as, I mean, it says, like number 1, you see it says setting bath, entrance to reservoirs, 2 are the reservoirs, 3 are the potter's workshop. This is not like a city. This is not like Gunnison size. This is like Lake, probably smaller than Lake City size, but it's meant to show you this was one of the structures they uncovered. It's meant to just show you a bit about their living. I was reading about that if you see it, there is a waterway that goes through and a bath, and so it was almost like this was in a period where some of the aqueducts were coming into play, and again, it shows you the value for us as Christians is it shows us the setting that Christ would have been in. If this was 4 BC to 68 AD. This was smack in the middle of where Christ was living. These were the type of buildings, the type of technology. No, he wouldn't have lived in here, but this is an example of the period of time.
Yeah.
I mean, he might have went, I don't know.
So Qumran is somewhere right over here.
Where you see it says Kirbet Qumran, that whole region is
Yeah.
sort of considered
Yeah.
Qumran.
Yeah.
And then, well, here, this says a cemetery. Yeah. There's a cemetery. Oh, anyway, so that's just as referential for you to kind of go from the larger picture of where Israel. So think of the northwest side of the sea, the Dead Sea is where we find the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, remember they were scattered throughout. All right, let's go over a few things about it. Maybe first and
Jason,
yeah.
how far was Qumran then from the cities that are mentioned in the Bible?
Oh, I mean,
Because it was never mentioned, but like what's the distance from Jerusalem, for instance?
I don't mind if you were to look at
Looking at the scale.
How far did she say? Probably about
Yeah.
less than 20 miles.
Yeah, look at the
Yeah.
scale.
yeah. So if you look at this
10
scale,
miles.
that's 20 miles, and there's Jerusalem,
Okay,
and then around here where that there's an arrow. So Qumran's there, but all around this region here, all the way down the western bank of the Dead Sea, they were finding these in the Judean desert. Now, why do you think that all these things were, and they were stored, they were scrolls stored in largely in clay pots? Why is this happening? Why are there, so in total, where's my 15,000 scrolls and fragments, mostly fragments to be clear, and about 800, somewhere I've written around 800 to 900 manuscripts represented, and mostly in Hebrew, but also in Aramaic and also in Greek. And just to remember that Aramaic was spoken during those last 400 years. Christ would have probably spoken Aramaic. They would have been, and in that process, around 200 BC before Christ is when the Hellenization came, when the Roman Empire came, and the Greek, and then you have the Greco-Roman Empire. That Greek influence eventually shifted the language So by the time that when Christ wrote in Aramaic in the sand about the casting rocks at the woman, writing in Aramaic was probably more the common usage, but they probably were at that point speaking Greek. And so again, which is why Christ would have read a Greek Old Testament, because that was the language of time. Now, he would have been taught Aramaic. Did he know Hebrew? Yeah, he probably knew Hebrew as well. But even then, I think we're so much more monolingual now than they were in that time. There was an interplay between those. All right, let's talk about the discovery. Again, probably, if not, is considered by most one of the most significant biblical and archaeological finds of not just, some people say the 20th century. I mean, and I don't want to say ever because but close to. I mean, I don't have the lens in order to claim that sort of, that title for it. But some view it as one of the greatest finds, and in part because in a period of high skepticism and a period of growing skepticism where the church is still vying for it, it was a discovery that validated much of the books. And again, 90%, I said there's a figure before, 90% of the Bible is overlaps to, close enough to that we have 90% accuracy. It's just that 10%. As I shared last week, it was the first discovery was in 1947, and that's on your page, the Cave One, or maybe late 1946. It was by a teenager, they think. I think that's what it said, a young person who was a Bedouin shepherd. I didn't know much about them. But historically, they're sort of they're Arab speaking, they're nomadic, so they moved with sheep and the flocks, and they're usually of a Middle Eastern or North African descent. They live in tents. They are considered strongly tribal, and they have been known for their resilience because they're living in some of the harshest conditions out in the deserts. And so they if you were to think of the guy in the desert who's tending sheep, this is a modern day picture of it, and they still exist today. He was from the Tara Mira tribe, and the young man's name was Muhammad Ed Dabib. And as the story goes, he was looking for a goat. He had lost his goat. And as he came by this cave, he wasn't about to go in it because you don't know what's inside of a cave. And he was thinking, hey, we're guessing he was thinking in his mind, said, hey, what if the sheep is in there or the goat is in there? And so he started throwing rocks into the cave. Well, he heard something break. He heard, and what it was a clay, was that? Pottery, clay jar. And he went in, and inside, he tossed it in, he heard a sound, and he went in there, and there were several clay jars, and in the first clay jar that they opened, there were 7 scrolls. And in those 7 scrolls contained, and it was honestly, I think, amazing, because had it been less than this, had it just been like little fragments, they might not have seen the significance of it. But it is the oldest, most complete version of Isaiah. It had the great Isaiah scroll. And so from this find, we have the oldest version of Isaiah known to history.
So we had Isaiah in the Bible.
From later manuscripts.
But it was just parts of this scroll?
No, don't think, it's not like we just have one. Every manuscript, I shouldn't say that, I don't know that to be true, but most manuscripts you'll have multiple versions, they compare them, they overlap them, they align them. But this was a complete version of the Isaiah scroll. And so this, corroborated the fact that all the other versions you'd have to dig into every single. I actually found, if you're very interested, I was looking on Wikipedia, which, I think these days with IA is probably AIs, but they have every single cave here listed. So Cave 1, and so if you click Cave 1, or here's Cave 3, for example, and I'll turn this so Jim and Glenda can see, it gives you the breakdown of, Cave 3, list of manuscripts in Cave 3. And it tells you the date it was discovered on March 14th, 1952, and it tells you what team discovered it. The cave initially yielded fragments of Jubilees, which is one of the apocryphal books, the Deuterocanonical books, and the Copper Scroll. And then if you click on this, it'll actually, the manuscripts, it gives you like the coding, the pictures, who discovered them. And it does, and it gives you references. Again, there's a lot of information, but in all 12 of those scrolls, or in all 12 of the caves, you can extract the summary all online. And my guess is, I didn't go that deep. My guess is you can actually, not that it would make a difference to see the actual scrolls, but you can see the scrolls actually in, where is it? In the, I said last week, in the Shrine of the Book, in the museum, Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can see it's where they're housed.
So because every book, there was no printing press.
Handwritten.
People were handwriting. So is this just another one of the handwritings that somehow got stored?
It's a copy that was probably, so the question becomes, why were these things stored where they were? And that is really an unknown, like there's not, we don't actually know exactly why they were put where they were at. Well, and that's really the thought. During the writings are from the third century before Christ to the 1st century after Christ. So again, the reason these are of significant importance for Christians is because it portrays the environment that Jesus was, these were the scrolls or the documents. So they would have had a scroll, and the thought is, the majority of the thought, or I would say, and there's lots of theories, but I would say the driving thought is that during the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when persecution was happening all across, that they took their documents and their fragments and they put them in what storage capacity they had, so jars, clay jars, and plugged them up and hid them in caves. They thought, who else would, in my mind, as I was, reading this today, I was imagining like the fear of like, oh no, we have to preserve these documents, emptying maybe food and things out of jars, or, that they emptying things out of jars, putting the sacred texts that they had and saying, where do we go? Well, where do you go? You go to the caves. I mean, we weren't in and so they started, and so there's no order. If you know things are being destroyed and these sacred texts are going to be lost forever, you take everything you can. And they knew, and in Israel's mindset, they remembered the exile. They remembered the invasion of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they remember the loss. This is why we don't have texts prior to 400 or 300, I guess 300 BC, really. I mean, we do. I mean, in some, but not in essence. This was the largest collection we have found from that period.
Sharon's bank deposit boxes.
That's right. Have they found any new stories? Or did they, that prior to 1946, stories that were not in the Bible, that had not?
Yes, there were new things revealed. I can't go in. And I didn't track that far deeply down. It was more about the corroboration of what was. 100% new stories came out, and the Deuterocanonical books were there, and they were preserved. And the preservation of those books should give us, as a modern day society, indication that they were important. They weren't like, hey, those are just the Tom Clancy novels on the shelf over there. Let's leave those. We aren't worried about those. These were sacred texts, so they stored them. And I mean, again, 15,000 fragments and scrolls and parchments. There was a lot in there, and it took years to extract it, and they're still sort of discovering it. So this kid takes these scrolls, goes home. They recognize his father recognizes it as a scroll of Isaiah. And in the documents, they also had the commentary on Habakkuk, not the book, a commentary. And so it shows you that even in biblical times, there were rabbis writing books, commentaries, thoughts about sacred texts. And we don't even read Habakkuk. I mean, it's like probably no one ever even talks about it. People don't even say the name half the time. And then they found also a scroll that had a community rule. And that had domestic and legal sort of specifications or guidance for the community at that time. And they connected it to a group called the Essenes. And the Essens were I don't want to say a desert group, but they lived outside the city. And so there was the Qumran, the village or the outline of the city. They were living outside the city, and they didn't know. They wouldn't have known that it was the only reason that the connection between the Essens is they know because of the documents that there was a Jewish population in Qumran because this was in the city, in the town. They know that the Romans destroyed the settlement around 70 AD, hence the preservation of the scrolls within the caves. And Flavius Josephus, who is a early writer in antiquity, identified the Essens, the group of Jewish folks who were living out there. He identified their rituals in his writings. And when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the reason they associate them with the Essens is because we have Flavius Josephus's description of these Essens rituals, and they matched the common rule or the rituals that were being listed or portrayed or suggested, or that they discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's why they think that there was this Jewish sect of Essens living out in this Qumran community. It doesn't necessarily mean also that all of these documents came from them, just because they're living nearby. I mean, when the whole country, it could have just been that's where the caves were, and everything ended up out there with the hope of preservation. And I mean, and honestly, when you think about this, if they were buried in 60, 30 years after Christ's time, and we discovered them in the last century, that is close to 2,000 years of sitting in some caves. Pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Pretty remarkable. Like I said, the scrolls were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, which shows the continuity. And the scrolls that were found in the desert were often dated later. So all the way up to I think the several centuries after Christ, the potential date. I think maybe up to 800s, which means that there could have been things that were placed thereafter. And with the copper scroll, that actually is somewhat true. And we'll get to that. We'll end with that, so keep you in suspense. As I know you're so excited about the copper scroll, Denny, as you're listening. It contains and in this discovery, it contained the oldest known copies of I think this number was a typo, but it said 5,912,447 biblical texts, and what that could mean is verses. But what is important is that in the global Christianity in the last 100 years, we've discovered texts that validate and refer to that time where Jesus was, and also the text, and also the usage of the text, and also the language of the texts. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. They were discovered between 1946, if you're at the late 46, and they were largely the major archaeological uncovery happened in about a decade. So it just took a long time. They're searching, but in the year or to 2 years after this Mohammed at Dabid found them, there was a race between the Bedouin shepherds in the Bedouin tribes and the archaeologists. I thought, actually, as I was reading this, I was like, this would make a great game. Someone plays the Bedouin shepherds, someone plays and you're trying to discover the scrolls to see who can get them as fastest. But what was interesting was, and again, I would say there's a certain level of discrepancies around even the stories of how these things unfolded. There are some that claim this story, and some, so I'm giving you with the caveat that the truthfulness of the story is recorded in history. I don't know whether it happened or not, but that the father tried to sell the parchments that he brought back, or the stuff back to, and they sort of dismissed him. And eventually he sold, I'm going to forget it now. It was like $100.
Yeah.
And then eventually after that, and then no one wanted these texts. They were just like, whatever. He went to New York, and he eventually took, I wish I could say I should have bookmarked the page, because I don't remember the details about it. But the long and short of it was, one of these guys went and he put an ad out, I believe in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh my
for fragments that dating back to 200 years because no one wanted them. Now, eventually, obviously, and this was in the first 2 years, eventually, once it was known what they were, the value of them were incalculable. But in that first 2 years, I think one of them were sold, they talked about fragments, some fragments sold at like a flea market, sort of bizarre type setting.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, what do I want an old piece of paper for? It doesn't say, so all that's to say is there's something for me when I read that about like the humility of Christ coming into the world and the disregarding, and then eventually you see the significance and the value of something. Anyway, that's sort of just an aside. It is near, like I said, that where it's near is Feshka in the western bank of the northern shore of the Dead Sea. Was found around a region called Ain of El Feshka, which means the spring of El Feshka. And Feshka is probably a name of a person who was governing a spring, or it's an unknown word that was somehow mistranslated. We don't know. But what it was a 6,200 acre nature reserve. So in other words, where the cave, that region of the caves where they're found was a nature reserve. And meaning it wasn't like something that people were trafficking in, that didn't, people went out there probably to pray, to meditate. They weren't, and it wasn't like a nature reserve now where it's gated and you had to pay a fee and you go in and, it was probably it was just kind of like an area and they had hot springs. And I read about the hot springs there. And so all that's to say is, it was never designed to be a hiding place. The hiding places were made by necessity of cultural events, urgency. And maybe some things were scored out there, but if you were like, hey, I need to store something very important, you wouldn't go up into the mountains, choose a random cave and shove it in that. It has a sense of
Put it in clay jars.
we don't know where, and put it in clay jars where anyone can find it. We don't know what else to do. So it's a miracle that they survived. So 15,000 scrolls and fragments, oldest surviving manuscripts. And so 3 types of literature: deuterocanonical, meaning the apocryphal books. But at the time, if they had discovered these 500 years earlier, they wouldn't have called them deuterocanonical. They would have just called them scripture. So part of that is when they were discovered. So they had these manuscripts. Again, you can go through those lists. Some of them validate the ones that are there. The first Jubilees as being one of the first. Where there are other documents like the Gospel according to Thomas. I think it sort of had a little bit of a spotlight in the last 30 years. It was like in the late 90s. There was this big thing about the Gospel according to Thomas. There were other books. Some of them describe Jesus as a kid. Mm-hmm. Again, is that fiction? Is that fan fiction? Someone's like, I like this guy. Let's write some fan fiction about his origin story. We don't know. We consider them valid documents for understanding, for shedding light on Jesus, but we don't count them as truth.
Sacred.
We count them as sacred in the sense if they're stored or they're set apart, and we're not going to disregard them, but we don't include them as canon or valid representations of Christ's childhood. We sit in the abyss of Christ as the infant who the Magi saw, all the way up to the point where you see him in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
But you said we did for 1,500 years.
Did what?
Did consider these writings.
We didn't. Well, that doesn't mean that yes, but not all the books in the Deuterocanonical things that were discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls were considered part of the Apocrypha.
Deuterocanonical.
In between the law and I mean they're considered canon, but they were developed. Deuterocanonical books were developed between 400 or written between 400 and the time of Christ.
But what does that mean? What's the translation of that?
Well, Deutero means law, so canonical law. I mean, books that were considered legal writings. I don't actually know you say that. I've just referred to that my whole life and never really broke it apart. We'll look it up at the end, what it actually means. Where else? We talked about that. At the time they were discovered, and I think this is important in particular, the question becomes, who owns the scrolls? And I went down a rabbit trail just because I thought it was interesting. But at the time, where the scrolls were actually discovered, there was in 45 and 46. There was it was considered the Jordanian annexation of the Western Bank. In other words, there was this large western region that belonged to Jordan. Jordan's on the other side of the Dead Sea. Israel's on the west side of the Dead Sea. Well, they had kind of curved over the top, and in that area that saw the West Bank, that was kind of around, I don't know if it was exact, but that's generally the category of the Jordanian annex. In where is it?
But they're in what is modern day Egypt now.
No, which
Or
one?
Israel. The
Israel.
scrolls
The scrolls are in
are
Jerusalem,
museum.
in a
In
museum,
Jerusalem.
yes,
Okay.
in a museum in Jerusalem. Israel declared, I wrote, these are sketchy notes down here. Where is it? Israel declared, where is it? I wrote it down. Oh, here it is. Israel declared their independence in May 14th, 1948.
Yeah.
So the scrolls were discovered in 1946, but it took a couple years for them to gain some. And so what happens is there's a race that comes out of this, and 11 caves are discovered between 1946 and 1956. And actually I wrote down just as an aside, Cave 4 which was discovered in 1952. So 6 years after the original cave, was the most productive cave. That one actually had 15,000 fragments alone, representing 500 different texts in one cave. So in 1948, Israel declares their independence. And in 1949, or 1948, the same year, you have the Arab-Israeli War, and the Jericho Conference. It was determined by the Arab nations. They formed an Arab coalition between Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, because Israel was claiming that land. And they declared their independence, and there was tension, and I guess that's just historic tension. Around that time, the UN had a plan to divide Palestine, which would be considered most of that region by the time, into Jewish and Arab states. But the Arab coalition didn't like that, so they decided to invade Israel. It was Israel's first armed conflict after being made a state almost immediately. And so they declared their independence. They were invaded. It led to, where is it here? Make sure I'm reading this right. 24th. Then the Jordanian annexation of the Western Bank came after that on July 24th, April 1950, and it lasted until July 31st, 1988. And what caused that to stop was in 1967, there was something called the Six-Day War. And that was to oppose, and then that's when Israel actually moved in and occupied the Western Bank. And they remained there. And in 1988, Jordan renounced claim to that land. And so what you have in that is this division between, I don't know why that's going on, these division between Israel and the Arab nations, primarily Palestinians, which were considered a larger portion of the territory, Jordanians, who were kind of coming over from the east side over to the West Bank, and that conflict still exists today. The question becomes, is Jerusalem, I mean, in terms of Muslims taking over, who does it belong to? Christians? Well, we have history in it. Does it belong to Jews? They have history in it. Does it belong to, Palestinians or Muslims? But here's the thing. We're all Abrahamic religions. When the answer is, who does it belong to? The answer kind of is yes.
Everyone. Yeah.
Because it does belong, because they're now. But the challenge of that goes back to our world religions discussion. Israel's like, this is our nation, this is our religion, this is our faith. And then Christianity, around the turn of the millennia, when Christ comes on the scene, says, nope, we're going to branch off because we have this belief that differs from your belief. And again, Islam, another branch. They said, "Oh, well, you Christians, you have some things right. You were some corrective. You offered some corrections to the problems with Judaism, but now we're going to add more." And they went one step further. So you have all, and we Christians too carry a little bit of that arrogance. I mean, it's our faith statement, but that we're right and Jews are wrong. The Jews are mistaken. Islam does the same for us. All Abrahamic, all worshiping in their mindset the same God, because it all goes back to Abraham. The Ishmaelites eventually became Muslims. So in fact, and that again, because Abraham had relations with Hagar and gave birth to Ishmael, and God said, "I'm going to make you a great nation too." So even from God, even recorded in our scriptures, God says, "I'm going to make a great nation out of this line as well." Now, does that warrant any sort of war or violence or anything that's happened over the last 2,000 years? Absolutely not. This goes back to my sermon a few weeks ago. Violence in a New Testament world where we are spirit-filled is always darkness and always condemned. You say, is there justified violence? You could argue from a human perspective of justified violence, but if we truly understood ourselves and the relationship to this world as in our own, and this is a temporal space, this is the notion of turn the other cheek. And people want to reject that, and pacifists will ride that till the end. Other people say, "Oh, God doesn't expect you not to defend yourself." Well, turn the other cheek does not mean that someone's breaking into your house and attacking you, and you're like, "Do it again, do it again." It means that in times of retribution, you say, "I will not read." And I think that plays into, if someone kills, if someone hurts your family, does that give you the moral right to hurt them back? And I would argue theologically, no. Because if this world is not our own, then we should never step into that place where we condone violence. Okay, what else do we have here? I said 3 categories of scroll: biblical, and that's the largest portion; apocryphal or deuterocanonical, we'll look up that word; and then sectarian or secular or extra biblical. Within the biblical category, there were fragments found of every Hebrew book of the Old Testament except Esther. No representation of Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there are those throughout history who were like, should Esther be considered a part of our canon? Should Esther, and Jews, actually, I don't know, I shouldn't say, I'm not 100% where Jews landed on that. I know that there was concern about the canonical nature, and the largest reason of that is you have a Jewish Persian queen, which gives some people problems. You have the intermingling of the Persian culture or the Babylonian culture with Jewish, culture in terms of marrying and intermingling. But even beyond that, Esther doesn't mention God. There's no reference of direct relation or connection to God.
What's her book talk about?
God is an acting player, and there's trust in God, but there's not interaction with God. So by Jewish standard of canonization, they wouldn't have held it as the Pentateuch. They wouldn't have held it as prophetic. They put it in the Great Assembly after they reestablished Jerusalem. In that period of Ezra and Nehemiah, after they returned from exile, it was included as a part of that. Many think the Great Assembly did that, which is a group of men who basically decided which books should be considered. How do we reestablish the identity? And they included Esther because it tells the story of the liberation of Jews or the salvation of Jews in this Persian context. Okay. Let's talk about Copper Scrolls. Cave 3. Denny, here's your stuff. I found this very fascinating. So Cave 3, either one of those 2 locations, I didn't look that closely at which one it was. Cave 3 is where it was located, but it wasn't located with the other jars, the other storage, the other scroll area. It was actually pushed way to the back. It was hidden in the back. And so there's some challenges around it because I wrote these. It was found in the
Different time frame.
What's that? Well, yes, and it actually is thought to. There were 20. What does that say? Oh, so the Copper Scroll. I'm going to read it as I go down, and I'll just hop around it. The Copper Scroll was found in Cave 3. It was copper or metal, but it was considered 1% mixed with 1% tin. But it was rolled, so they couldn't open it. So in order to get it, after they found it, to figure it out, they had to actually cut it into pieces. They called in some museum experts. They didn't try to unroll it, and so it's been cut into strips, 23 strips. From 1955 to 1956, they looked and they cut. Well, there's no. Otherwise, the fear is if you start to unroll it, and that metal breaks. So they're cutting it in fragments so that the bend is, and
So
again,
when they first
and
did
get
it,
it
it was
out.
bendable, you think, and then.
my
over
guess is if it
time-
was metal, it's probably bendable, but they
Then
probably
over
were
time.
afraid to open it because you don't want it to like crack and then if it cracks in the middle of some of the
Well,
script.
you'd think it must be pretty important if they were gonna make it out of metal, you know?
Well, here's the thing that's interesting about it. So it dates back to 50 to 100 AD.
Okay.
So this is after Christ, and this is sometime between the invasion of Jerusalem and the second, and when the invasion of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So again, shortly after Paul was in prison, Jews are being persecuted, Christians are being persecuted. Everything, it's not a great scene for anyone. And so at this time, this is when it's thought to date back to. I don't even know what that says. Sometimes I write things down. So interestingly enough, it is not scripture. And this is what Denny didn't mention, and I didn't look closer until today. It's actually a treasure map. Oh, another game.
Really?
It's a treasure
Oh.
map that provides coordinates for 64 different hiding places that have caches of silver and gold, up to where did I write this? Several dozen. It's thought to have contained several dozen tons of gold and silver, and it's all around Jerusalem.
Oh, my word.
It's a treasure map. It's an aberration of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's written on different document. It's in the back of a cave. They don't know when it was placed there, why it was placed there. They originally cut it into two sections. It was two sections of one scroll. They were 7 and almost 8 feet in length. They had Hebrew and Greek letters that were chiseled into the metal strips. So it's not pressed. They're not pressing it. It's not like, in my mind, I kind of thought a scroll, like it was like embossed
Yeah,
almost,
yeah.
but it's just metal and it's scratched into it. So both Hebrew and Greek letters, but here's the thing. It was, the words were an unconventional vocabulary and odd spelling. So in other words, they
Another
think it was
mystery.
coded.
That's what I was just gonna
Sure.
say.
Um,
Seems to me like
It was, and has an entirely different Hebrew as related to the documents that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew that was in those. It was closer to what's called a Mishnah, which is the oral tradition or the oral Torah. So before they had parchments, before they wrote things, there was something called Mishnah, which was the oral tradition of the history of Israel. And so the Hebrew and that eventually was written down, obviously. And then, so in other words, the question is it primitive Hebrew? Is it purposefully done that? It's not as old as the oral tradition, but it has this connection to the oral tradition, fragments of Greek and Hebrew written on an unconventional scroll, hidden in the back of the cave, and contains 64 hiding places. Now let me see if I can
And
find.
have they found?
No, and to
treasure?
this date, no one has any. No, there's been no discovery of not a single one of those things. And let me see if I have this here.
Now we know.
So-
Denny was interested in a treasure.
That's what I'm saying. Denny was like,
Denny is not here tonight.
To
I'm
defend
thinking
himself.
He's on a plane.
Yeah.
Going over to.
Israel.
he did a couple early works. And, was reading about it. He's like, maybe I should get a jump.
Either they have not decoded it, or the treasures have already been found.
Or they were never there.
You don't go to that much trouble.
You know.
There are 64 spots.
But-
there was nothing.
But
there.
it seems to
One
me.
spot.
So here's an example of the words and the translation of the words. In the cave of the column with 2 entrances, facing east, in the north entrance, dig for 3 3 cubits, there is an amphora there, in it a book, under it, and then there was a blank, 42 talents, and then another blank. In the cavity at the base of the rock facing east, dig in the entrance for 9 cubits, 21 talents.
Where's Indiana Jones?
Yeah.
I'm really shocked that this copper thing hasn't made it into more mainstream thinking about
That
these
is
things.
cool.
So none of them are recovered, and still, yeah. So I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's not scripture.
Yeah.
The reason we probably don't hear about it in Christian circles is it's more in the vein of Indiana Jones than it is in biblical archaeology. In our last few minutes, and one of the questions I said is what else have there been new discoveries? Have there been new findings? And there actually have been a couple that I do want to note. There's been a discovery in 2007 and they numbered it, and it's not on here. It's called Cave. I don't think it's called Cave 12. Is it on there? I don't think it's not on there.
We have 11.
No, 11 until 2017 there were 11 caves.
Yeah.
Well, they found a cave, and there were dozens of new Greek fragments, pieces of Zechariah and Naaman, and there were evidence of scrolls that were likely there and where there were storage, in terms of the dirt that were taken out. So they believe there were more scrolls in there, but that it might have been raided. Who knows what happened to them? And then in 2021, so during COVID,
Wow.
yeah, they dig deeper into the Cave 8, which now they call the Cave of Horror. And it was this was a Judean desert refuge cave. And you'll understand what that means in a second. In that, they found one of the oldest 2,000-year-old fragments that corroborated with the 12 minor prophets, so pieces of that. But they also found 40 skeletons. And they thought that they were Jewish rebels who were hiding from a Roman occupation and invasion, and that they starved to death hiding in the caves. And they thought that probably happened between 132 to 136 AD.
Wow.
So almost 1900 years old. We see evidence of persecution. We see evidence of, and so you have 40 people hiding in a cave, fearing for their lives, not having food, having no way of getting food, eventually died. And it was during something called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which I didn't look that much into that. All of the documents were in Greek. Except for where God's name was used, and then it was written in Hebrew, which.
And Yahweh?
The Lord Adonai. I mean, they wouldn't have written the tetragram. They wouldn't have said it. But that part was written in tetragram was written in Hebrew. Everything else is in Greek.
Okay.
So in this community who stored these, it demonstrates there was still a deep respect for the name of God, even though they were writing in Greek. It wasn't like they were translating God's name into Greek. To a couple of the things they found in there, they found 2nd century Roman coins. They found a 6,000-year-old child's skeleton.
6,000?
Yeah, and again, that depends on your belief in carbon dating and things like that. But and then they also found what they dated as a 10,500-year-old woven basket.
Wow.
So the caves clearly, long before Abraham, were being used. Maybe that's the notion of the refuge cave. As I mentioned last week, some of the impact, and again I'll just mention those because we kind of flew through that, and we'll end on this note. The authority of biblical texts, as I said in previous, in the series, 90% of the Bible we have sort of overlapping in a good way. I mean, that shows that there's connection. And it also shows variations. Some of the text, there was a little nuance, but again, that lends to the idea it's not about the actual literal words, it's about the essence that comes through that, because even in our discoveries, even in claiming the consistencies of those, there's still a notion of there's nuances, and that's not an I think in an age of 1800s to the 1950s where Christians felt like they had to prove themselves, they saw that as weakness. I don't see that as weakness. I see that as the majesty of God's gospel coming through. Everyone adds their own touch to it. Everyone adds their own, and that doesn't mean that they're less authoritative. It doesn't mean they're less from God. It just means humans had their hand on it, and things change. The context of first century rituals around the essence, around ritual washing, around concerns for the end of times, as a whole, they fill out those narratives. They give us extra biblical stuff where we can see how they live their lives. We get a picture into the rituals of the essence and how they practice their, and their value and what books they thought were important and held. It gives us a portrait from Second Temple Jerusalem forward, which for most part sort of emphasizes the notion of there was more diversity even at that time in religious thought and in Judaism than we may have suspected. I think we look back and we think Judaism had their act together and they all believed the same thing. The same thing is highly true. Anyone who studies the early church would say in the first 300 or 400 years up to the time of Constantine, where you had councils that solidified things, baptismal rites. There was no notion of the Trinity. The belief systems were all, you think you take a movement in the first century after Jesus, it maintained, you had, scriptures being written that eventually were passed down. Well, no one was guiding, no one agreed on anything. The belief in who Jesus was across the board. The belief in a lot of the things in the relationships between Jews and all of those things would have been not unified. Unification came in Constantine's calling of councils from all the different parts of Eastern and Western, Eastern in the sense of what is now Middle East and Russia, and that in towards, Greek domain, and then all the West, all the way to the Atlantic Sea. And again, 700, there were seven, I didn't say this, but last week I did, there were 700 non-biblical works of those. Which shows you they were storing anything they felt was sacred. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just, this is the holy word of God, let's get this, let's leave those. Anything that would preserve who they were. But again, they've had loss of identity how many times? Mm-hmm. They've had a transition of identity, they have a reestablishment of identity. Even in the midst of the Deuterocanonical period, this 400 years, you have the Maccabean revolts that sought to reestablish Jewish identity in a revolution, in a violent movement. The Maccabean massacre. There was a lot of death happening. Perhaps most broadly, information about languages, the community rules, daily life, how Jesus's worldview. And I think that notion of giving us a little bit more of a picture into what it was like for the Savior, what part of the history, the time in history that Jesus came into the world and was able to step into, could he have come back 1,000 years later, 1,000 years prior? I mean, obviously it was God's timing, but in that, God chose that time, God chose that period, God chose that region, that location, God chose that lineage. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls ultimately offer us is not anything we didn't have. It didn't, for Christians globally, it didn't say, hey, now this is true, look at us. It was, now it's fuller. And we tried to use that in a time where secularization was creeping in, and we're trying to hold on to that, like this is validation. But just as I read on Sunday, the scripture doesn't need validation. God will call who God will call. The scripture doesn't need us to defend it, because those who believe will believe. And that's God's, movement throughout. So is it a valuable resource for us? 100%. But I got to tell you, after looking at this over the last couple of days and a little bit more in depth, the one thing that stands out to me that really sort of took me is that I want to find some treasure in Jerusalem. That copper map, I was like, there's no games about this. So my mind's already running. So
maybe that's the project. We should make up a game.
We should. Maybe that'll be.
Yes, you can have a new game.
Jason,
Yeah, glad to.
was there anything in all those, whatever, thousands of scrolls that challenged accepted belief? were contradicted? What was considered
No, because that's where
biblical
you that's where you
ideas?
get the 90% overlap. I mean, are there discrepancies in the 10%? Yeah, but that's not anything new. And so it doesn't, and not that it would raise, not to the extent that if there was, it would have raised to the value of saying this is important, we have to understand. But to dig into deeper, but in general, no, not that I saw that there was any major controversies or many. I think in the biblical, in the quest for the historic Jesus to define this human being of Jesus, I think there are things that came out of that sort of took some liberties in understanding Jesus. Like, I think this is where you get the reconstruction of Jesus's childhood from. Okay, so the last I just typed in deuterocanonical refers to specific books and passages of the Old Testament, which doesn't help. That's what we already knew that. The term means second canon in Greek.
Okay.
There you go.
Second
Okay.
canon.
So, deutero. Does deutero doesn't mean
Must be second.
Yeah,
in
maybe.
some language, yeah.
so. And most of them are written deuterocanonical between 250 and 50 BC. So,
Thank you.
and that's the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, safe travels.
So
too.
interesting.
So.
I always wanted to be
And
an
it is
archaeologist.